identified, work with them, empower them, even if education would remain. I'm not so much for the online education for women, because I do receive calls from women who are right now at home and they cannot go out. And they share their frustration that they feel locked, they feel imprisoned. It impacted their psychology overall. And some of them, they want to just leave because of all this, the feeling of being imprisoned. They're working from home, but the feeling of being imprisoned. So that's why the online packages for the long term is not going to help women. I mean, women should go out, they should work outside, and there should be open space for them. So in such situation, even though, again, I'm against of long-term continuation of online packages, but it's good that education packages for women should continue. Civil society should be empowered, either if it's through humanitarian packages. Most of the civil society in Afghanistan, they have shift their strategy from security, rights, or whatever they used to work, development, governance, to humanitarian. They are there. They were working in different other sectors, but now Taliban have forced them to work only on one particular strategy, which is mostly humanitarian. So the economic development and all the governance and peace and security, they have taken really a back seat. Therefore, but they are there, the bases are there, so it's good to work with them. Civil society should be mobilized, should be empowered, should be supported. I mean, the doors should not be closed on them from international community. And through either technical support, kind support, or exposure, the civil society should, most of the civil society are out actually, but civil society meant the people who empowered from last 20 years. But the new people are ready to step in, to take in those roles, and those has to be empowered. In Afghanistan, in the remote areas, I think one of the drawbacks of the Republic time was there was less focus on the remote areas. By the remote areas means 50 minutes drive from the center of town. So because of so much technical reasons, those places were deprived of certain assistance. So this is based on lesson learned. It's good to focus on the remote areas too for change. Target them, work with them, either they are elders, religious leaders, whoever. They are part of civil society. So civil society shouldn't be confined to only NGOs. It's a broader area in Afghanistan that councils come under there, elders of communities come under that. The other small entities and working groups are there who work with the organization. They are part of those. So those should be supported. And women groups, most of them are working in hiddenly or secret. They have secret bases. At least those should be supported at this time when we see less opportunity for a very systematic change. I think those people-centric approach, either through humanitarian aid, but empowering them, working with them, or through other educational packages should be the way forward.
And if I can just ask a follow-up question, aside from kind of working and empowering civil society, as the international community is engaged on Afghanistan, are there specific leverage points that you think could be effective in terms of addressing issues of gender persecution with the Taliban?
Well, the engagement has been there with the Taliban from 2.5 years. So engagement is not really a new issue. It was from day one, for a high-level engagement were with them. But unfortunately, no concrete outcome on women's, if we're talking specifically on women's rights issues. So I think that should be some of the support to the current authorities should be conditional. Whatever support it is, cash or kind, is going to them, that should be conditional, particularly on issues of women's rights. For example, the girls' education should be one of the major negotiation topic at the table of negotiations, and that has to be negotiated with any kind of support which is provided to the regime. And that conditional support, especially in terms of women's rights, we haven't seen happen. And support has been given to the current regime without putting that particular point into serious consideration. So there should be that serious conditional engagement with the Taliban on issues of women and girls' education.
Thank you. Mariam, the report you produced had a number of recommendations. Could you summarize a couple of the key recommendations that you've identified?
Sure. Well, the three that I'd like to reiterate here is one that's that's really along the lines of what Dr. Sakhi just mentioned, is that international actors must keep the interests of women and girls central to the negotiation process with the Taliban, including ensuring women have a place at the negotiation table. Now, what that means is it doesn't mean that you consult only before or after or on the side, but that you do all that, and you have to ensure that you've got women and civil society actors, women-led organizations present at the table when these talks are happening. When the UN Secretary General dismissed the demands of the Taliban by saying that we should be the only representatives of Afghans here and not the group of civil society that you have brought in, him saying no to that was probably one of the strongest actions I had seen the UN leadership take in years, really. And I think that it's really important that that continues. And now that we're looking at the next Doha meeting coming up, I hope that in the pursuit of trying to bring the Taliban to the table, that civil society and women human rights defenders won't become a side dialogue in this process, that they will be in the process like they were in Doha, and perhaps even more constructively coming this time around. Secondly, maintaining girls' education is a central resistance strategy to early and forced and child marriage. That's quite simple. And what I mean by this is that it builds the agency, the daughter's agency in voice and decision-making about their future. Now, as mentioned earlier, online education is playing a really central role right now when we don't have schools opening, but it is not a replacement for a formal education system, and it can never become. And second of all, if tomorrow the Taliban announce that they are not opening schools, but they're opening madrasas all over the country, and girls can go to the madrasas, that too is not a replacement for a formal education system. So I hope that there are no sort of really trigger happy stakeholders here and thinking, oh, well, great, we've got madrasas open. So, we've got one goal has been met. No, it's far from it, to be honest. Formal education needs to be open for boys and girls. That's it. And I think we need to be very steadfast and committed to this. And lastly, speaking specifically on the norms element of resistance, based on our conversations in the focus groups, it was mentioned that community-based groups should be funded to facilitate dialogue and discussion within families to support the alignment of marriage practices with positive change in individual beliefs about marriage norms. And so the household, the community can continue to play a positive role in that process, and this should be encouraged and facilitated. But if you look at the recommendations, we start from very macro level and we go micro. You need both. At times I see stakeholders taking the approach of the more micro level. Let's pragmatic, practical, who can we fund and how can we support this? And that's all great. And as Dr. Sakhi mentioned, it's important. But unless you have the more structural conversations happening at this level, such as, like, for example, these Doha events and other multilateral spaces, you're never going to have substantive change on the ground. And you're just going to continue to go in circles, and nothing will really change. You're just, as I mentioned at CSW a week ago, it's just a Band-Aid, and that's all you're doing is you're just putting a Band-Aid on it. So we have to be cognitive of that.
Okay, thank you. Aisha, Mariam talked about how encouraging or requiring the continuation of education is critical for curtailing early marriages. Is there anything else the international community can do to support families and girls to reduce the drivers of child and early and forced marriages in Afghanistan?
So actually, this is a political question because the international community has a broader political problem on its hands about how to handle the Taliban and engage or not engage with it and address the regime as it stands, and how to do this by ensuring that they still have some key leverage with the Taliban so that they can get concessions on things like the way they treat women. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question at all, and I don't think the international community has figured it out. But there is one point I would just like to make in the conversations I've had with other representatives of other governments that are dealing with backlash in their countries. They're finding that increasingly they're having to instrumentalize the work that they do abroad as development actors. Rather than support women's rights per se, they're having to instrumentalize their engagement and say, no, actually, you know, we should do sexual and reproductive health programming because it's good for national development and we'll show you how. Wow. I mean, how? And education is good because it improves your, you know, growth and so economic growth and so on and so forth. I think that I would caution that the instrumentalization of women's gender and development is a slippery slope. And I think that the international community does need to take a firmer stand, as Mariam was mentioning. When they do, it could potentially be effective. And finally, just a comment about Muslim states. Is it possible that they could more robustly contest the Islam that the Taliban are implementing? I don't know if that area of leverage has been explored as efficiently as it could have been, to say that, is this really the Islam that we want the Muslim world to be recognized as implementing globally? And are there not competing interpretations of how women can be treated under even Islamic dispensations? I don't know if there's any easy answers to this, but these are some questions that need to be engaged with seriously.
Thank you. And then a final question for Niloufar. We talked about this a little bit in the last round of questions, but as it seems that members of the international community are getting closer to potentially recognizing the regime in Afghanistan. What recommendations do you have for the international community as they kind of explore or weigh those options?
Well, I first think recognition shouldn't be at the table at this point. Well, Taliban, it's time for evaluating what Taliban have done and what Taliban have whatever they committed, they have met all those commitments or no. So I think recognition shouldn't be at the table. This is not the time for that. The time should be to evaluate the last 2.5 years of engagement for the international community. I mean, and then they should have a thematic focus. I mean, the international community, for example, on security, what has been achieved, on women's rights, what have been achieved. On, for example, corruption, that Taliban do claim that they reduce corruption, but again, there was no money. So we have to find the indicators of that. So I think there should be some more data. I would say more research has to be conducted at this point for all this thematic focus in terms of what has been done. Of course, governance and all other related issues come up. So recognition shouldn't be at the table. The second is that the discourse should continue. I mean, as Dr. Aisha mentioned, we see a less appetite from the international community also at this point. There are lots happening in the world politically. In the region, there's a lot happening. So there is less focus on Afghanistan, unfortunately. So I would like to see more discourse happening by, I'm glad UN is doing a lot of work, that work right now. The international community organizations, humanitarian organization, they should keep the discourse. They should keep alive the cause of Afghanistan. I think that is by itself is a big contribution to the future of Afghanistan. Not let die the cause, not let die the discussion that everything is settled and everything is rosy there, and let's stop that. I was actually very happy with Ned bringing that reframing security, because one of my critique has been that, well, nobody's talking about security anymore about Afghanistan. Everybody thinks that, well, everything is now good, then there's no security crisis, nobody is being killed on the streets, so let's not talk about security. But that's not true, actually. I'm glad that Ned has brought this up, because that's exactly what I've been talking about, that we have to bring security at the discourse and talk about the changing nature of security. There are security crises, but the nature has changed. So all these points at this point, this thematic issues needs focus, discourse, because we have completely new system in place, and new landscape is there, new security landscape, humanitarian landscape. So that all has to be discussed. Data should support some of the argument, and that's the time for all those. I don't see really a very dramatic, concrete change at this point. And I don't see there is an appetite from international community for any dramatic change in Afghanistan at this point. But these pieces of work may lead to a change in future, whatever change we want to see that may lead. So this discourse, continuation of discourse, data to support the argument, and keeping the cause alive, the Afghanistan cause alive. That is where international community can contribute a lot at this point.
Great, thank you all very much. I now want to turn to our audience, both in the room and online. Unfortunately, online there's no space to ask questions, but if you're joining us online and have questions, please email my colleague Marjan Mateen, Marjan, M-A-R-J-A-N-M, @NED if you have any questions. So now we'll just take a few questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for this discussion. The opening speaker mentioned that women's rights and human rights need to be integrated better, and efforts need to be made to not silo or deprioritize women's rights. Do any of the presenters on the panel have any ideas of how to do that better? How to integrate better women's rights with human rights and make efforts so that women's rights are not deprioritized?
Let's see, are there any more questions so we can take a few at a time?
Thank you very much for this report and also for this discussion. I have two questions. First of all, I see these Western feminist movements or mainstream here. They see the women's issue in Afghanistan as a third world issue. Unfortunately, the efforts here are not in line so much with the changes in Afghanistan for the women's situation. How we could see that change happen? That the meso level Mariam mentioned, we need that. We don't need Afghan women just shout for themselves, and people here, they see like, okay, Afghan women, that's their issue. We need that, collaboration between feminists in Afghanistan, from Afghanistan, and also feminists from here. How we can see that change happen? And strongly, we see feminists here that we should make change. We should, take action against that gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Second, when we see the rise of authoritarian regimes and these regimes using religion or misinterpreting religion for their gains and strategies and policies, what are the roles of democratic world to strengthen them instead of, shrinking them or removing them? Thank you.
I think we had another question here as well.
Thank you. Following to the question that she has, as a feminist, how can the voice of Afghan women how can we as the outside women from outside of Afghanistan can help and see what their sufferings? Now, obviously, we can see it in the news and everything, but how can we be able to speak for them as far as their rights? Because you mentioned earlier that that's the biggest issue, how their rights are not being established and heard. So how can we do it for them? Thank you.
Zach? Sorry.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, please give the mic to the Afghans. That's what I would say. That's how you support. Give the spaces to the Afghans. My question is for any of you, maybe Mariam Jan. Ms. Amiri mentioned the committees or the forums that exist of Afghan experts. Can you maybe perhaps tell whoever is interested here how to put these expertise on the right tables, so that the coordination of these committees is extremely important in order to create the spaces that the Afghans need to bring those voices. The legitimate spaces that are there needs to be filled with the Afghans. So this process has to be Afghan owned. Maybe you can talk about that and see how a coordination mechanism that is needed for that. Thank you.
Zach, I think we have 4 questions, so let's start and give each panelist a few minutes to respond to those, and then we can take another round of questions. Marian.
Oh, thank you. In terms of, let me start with your question. In terms of coordination, I think that the mechanism that Ms. Amiri talked about that has been set up here, that mechanism is something that is implemented elsewhere as well, and it actually works pretty well in the sense that what is happening here is identifying various, I mean, we've got expertise in all categories. So identifying categories or working groups of experts, and then connecting with all the relevant policymaking institutions within a capital. And then whenever that capital needs to consult, when that institution needs to consult on a particular topic, let's say it's rule of law, or if it's governance, or it's women's rights, then what they do is they consult with you to bring in, to connect from inside of Afghanistan, a few experts to speak directly with that institution. And I hear that that's happening quite regularly here through that mechanism, and I think that's really fantastic. Now, yes, we've got a lot of various forums that have established, both here as well as in Europe. And as of right now, we don't have a coordination mechanism that can bring all of these forums together, so we can consolidate or strengthen our efforts. And developing such a mechanism to do so would not be any easy endeavor. It would be a challenging one, but I believe that there is a process underway to try to connect them. So when we see something happening at the UN, or we see something happening at another multilateral level, and advocacy organizations are drawing up letters, they're drawing up petitions, you normally have numerous petitions and letters coming out, which are still very good. But consolidating that and bringing that into one document is quite powerful. And so I believe that various women's rights organizations are working on creating a coordination mechanism that can sort of bring all of this together. In terms of prioritizing women's rights, well, the way that we do it at Drops, I'll speak for myself, the way we try to do it is we've taken the route of gathering data where we saw a very deep gap. So we gather data from women, women's perspectives, as I mentioned, in the thousands, regularly. And then we put these perspectives into policy briefs that are absorbable by policymakers. Short and quick and what it is that they need. And then we try to channel them to all the correct institutions and all of the key capitals that are currently working on Afghanistan. And how we do this is we try to time it with something important that is taking place. Whether it's UNGA, or whether it's the Doha event, or whether it is the review of UNAMA's mandate at the UN, or whatnot. So we try to make sure that we get it to policymakers before they go into those meetings, in the hopes that it informs their decision making. It's still it's a struggle. It's a struggle because we talk about local ownership, but local ownership still is treated very rhetorically. And it's all over the place. And we saw it with the state building and peace building mission in Afghanistan. So it's really still an uphill battle. We talk about inclusivity, but it's just rhetorical, really. So unless you leverage it where it becomes a prerogative they cannot ignore, at times it is sidelined. For example, in the Doha event and the assessment, the independent assessment on Afghanistan, it prioritized counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics, and counterterrorism, way above human rights and women's rights. It really did. Then it did put a caveat in there, which was thanks to actually all the advocacy that Afghan women inside and outside were doing, that unless the Taliban uphold and respect Afghanistan's obligations under international law, there could never be recognition. But I would say that was one of the examples of advocacy really proving itself. But that's some example of how we do it at our organization.
Yeah, just a quick comment, which is that I think that what happens in other countries serves as the best model for how to sustain a commitment to human rights and within that women's rights, and how democracy can effectively decide the extent to which it wants to engage with religion in public life. And what's happened is that because the UN, as the standard bearer for human rights, has become so disempowered and under attack globally, and as Western democracies are struggling with their own rollback of the power of democratic participatory democracies, that portends very badly for countries that are struggling to democratize. So really the best way to help a struggling country like Afghanistan move in the direction of upholding human rights and developing democracy is to ensure that it's taking place in your own home, because that, and also ensure that the UN retains power and credibility and authoritativeness, not to let its moral authority be eroded, because what happens in one side of the world affects what happens in the other. So the rise of a certain kind of misogynist politics in the West is very bad for the rest of us in other countries.
There was a question about how to prioritize women's rights and how to make change, and why things are not producing and result, I think, what I understood from the question. If you look at the history of women's movement in Afghanistan from 1920 till now, we see where the problem is. I think that should give us a real problem. For me, when I did a research way back in 2005, and that was through NET actually, where I look at from 1920 till the 2002, 2002-3, I saw all the nature of the systems and governments, and then what was the major cause of why women's conditions still in Afghanistan remain the same and why nothing has changed. One of the major findings of my research at that time, which I think resonates quite well to the current time, is that the frequent collapse of systems and frequent collapse of government. And we see that from last 20 years, at least the history of last 20 years is in front of us. I started on these issues at the end of 2001. And we started all the things that we are discussing now, we actually started talking about all those stuff in 2002, 2003. And it took us 20 years to at least institutionalize some stuff, to change some unwanted norms. I remember I was going to the village in Badqis and Khor to launch literacy classes for girls. It was soon after the first regime of the Taliban. And then the elders, they wouldn't allow, the male members wouldn't allow their girls to go to school and to let us go. And we worked with them for 3, 4, 5 years consecutively, sensitizing men first, in order to allow us to let women go to, the adult women and also girls go to education in those remote areas and the villages and provinces. And then after 5, 6 years, when I was back in the same provinces and the same villages, you could see the changes. I mean, those elders, those male members, they created their own literacy packages, and they sustained it. So it took many of those actors, international community, the funding, the current time authority, everyone, to put all those efforts for some change. Those are very small changes, but lots and lots of challenges, believe me. But at least those were hopes for many of us who were working. So then what happened after 20 years, with few steps taken, everything went back. The same you would see from 1920, and every 10, 20 years, the same change happened. A little bit of change, and then few steps back in terms of women's rights. A few steps forward, and then a drawback. So I think that is one of the major causes of why women's issue, or why women women issue overall doesn't get institutionalized first, and why the norms are not changing. For example, in the report, there's a lot about norms. What worries me, what concerns me, is this decrease. If it remains decrease for a long time, they will be institutionalized norms. And then the women themselves will oppose change. That was concerned me in such a context. Because that exactly, we had these experiences in 2002 and 2003, because some women even were not letting us to proceed further with some of our women's rights programs, because they were saying that they were against the culture, they're against our religious belief and all. And it took us a while to change at least and modify some of those perceptions. And now the same thing start from the scratch. And this decrease will change the people's perception about themselves. The women about their own agency. You know, women will start believing, if this decrease will continue, that they are made to be confined at home. And that's their role, the social productive role that Dr. Aisha was mentioning. That's actually what they have to do. The rest is not their area to touch. So that institutionalized norms is dangerous for society and will not allow women to move forward. That will further radicalize the society and will undermine the agency of women further and further. And that is where, going back to your question, I think, and that the continuous collapse of government system and then going back and forth, that did not let women empowerment to happen in society. And that's actually one of the drawbacks.
We have time for another round of questions, and we have a hand raised here.
Thank you so much. Two quick questions. First one for Mariam Safi. You mentioned that you saw that the UN leadership, you sort of praised the UN leadership for making this decision of not making this concession to the Taliban, but you also said that was actually one of the strongest signals you saw in years. What does that say about the UN in general? And should we also speak about, let's say, a certain failure of international organizations when it comes to women's rights? And the second question for Aisha Khan, you mentioned in a side note almost the instrumentalization of sort of women's rights in the humanitarian aid and development space. Maybe you can just give us one or two more sentences on that. I find that very interesting and worrying as well. Thank you.
There's another question in the back here.
Hi, Sadiq Amini from ORF America. I start with a hope. I hope that the global community of women see the situation in Afghanistan not like a situation of women in Afghanistan. It's a global situation for women, because women are fundamentally women first before being Afghan or American or anything else, the same way that men are. Any problem that men or women face anywhere in the world is particularly to their gender. Imagine if the table was reversed, 20 million men being imprisoned by women somewhere, no man would have called this as national security issues or national interest, and they would be engaging, they would be talking, there would be bombards, there would be action. And so I hope everybody sees that in that context. And so that leads me to the question that, you know, authoritarian regimes support authoritarian regimes. The Taliban came in power because authoritarian regimes were supporting them. And so what makes me wonder is, why would then the democracies come into this game and be facilitative or act in a way that continues to allow this authoritarian regime, the worst type of authoritarian regime, which is also ideological, which is also religious, to breathe? Why are democracies allowing this? Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Marjan, do we have anything from email? Okay, so final questions.
Well, in terms of the question about the UN, well, I mean, I think I said it when I mentioned that was the hardest stance they had taken since August of 2021. And it's true. The UN, in my opinion, has till date, it has failed the women of Afghanistan, as well as those of minority groups in Afghanistan as well. And we've seen this time and again. So many examples I could give you, starting from humanitarian aid. Initially, when the idea for when after August 2021, the immediate reaction was, okay, we have to get humanitarian aid to Afghanistan because there's going to be an utter collapse and chaos. And it's true, there was a humanitarian crisis and we did needed those funds. But in the pursuit of humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, you also saw, agencies within the UN prioritizing humanitarian aid, and us arguing for principled humanitarian aid, being told there's no such thing as principled humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is just humanitarian aid, and it goes to everybody when it's required. And then we saw a year later when the Taliban announced an edict that women could no longer work for both local NGOs, INGOs, as well as the UN. Now, that edict and that statement preventing women from working with the UN was a direct violation of the UN Charter. And when that happens, normally the UN will leave a country, because now you are targeting its own staff and its own charter for the work that it's doing in that country. And I was so surprised to see that the UN, especially the humanitarian aid agencies, respond by saying, okay, their female staff stayed at home. They continued to get their salaries, I believe, but they were able to stay at home. And humanitarian aid agencies within the UN system then started to work to justify that having women stay at home did not have an impact on the delivery of humanitarian aid. They tried to build stats and hire consultancy agencies to go and do interviews and surveys and I don't know what, to prove that it's not making an impact, so it's okay, we can continue like this. Whereas we were doing surveys on this specific topic, and we asked women that if this ban had made any impact on the delivery of humanitarian aid. And they said yes, particularly to female-headed households. And then when we asked them what were some of the impacts that this was happening, one of the gravest impacts of this was the exploitation of the delivery of this aid to women in Afghanistan, because now only men were delivering aid to women in Afghanistan. So there is a dynamics of power that shifts here. And so that was quite alarming. So yes, the UN has failed terribly in that regard.
We just got the 1 minute warning.
I know, I
Can
saw
we have
that.
just a few more minutes for everyone? So just a few more minutes, and I'm going to add one more question to the pile since we have very little time. But if there's any final takeaways, calls to action as a result of this discussion,
Yes.
Miriam, you want to?
There was actually one other question. I think our colleague from RF, in terms of work with totalitarian to to give space to a totalitarian regime to come up, and why are democracies getting engaged? I don't believe that the totalitarian governments brought about another totalitarian government. I believe that liberal democracies, in addition with totalitarian states, carved the space for the Taliban regime to come to power. I mean, who was negotiating with the Taliban? It was Ambassador Khalilzad, as far as I remember, and the key strategic partnership of the Afghan state, and then the key partner of the Taliban during those talks were the United States, the Western world. So no, I think it was just about everybody in the multilateral institution, the P5, and so it's a mix. And I think that there is this thought under the liberal peace agenda that, from when it was written till now, I think it continues to bear so much weight, that liberal democracies will easily justify illiberal means in the hopes to have liberal pursuits or goals attained at the end. And I think this is one of those processes that went haywire. Now, I don't know what the long-term idea of it was, but let's not mistake liberal democracy, certainly in the way it was approached, let's say, had a big role in where we are now in Afghanistan.
Any final takeaways and recommendations, calls for action?
The call for action to everybody that's here is continue to keep the issue of human rights, minority rights, and women's rights in Afghanistan central to everything that you do. That's in particular your research, your advocacy, and your programming. If we focus on just practical, pragmatic steps, thinking that that's going to take us somewhere, it won't unless you really advocate for structural change at the higher level. And they both have to go hand in hand if we want to actually see some sort of sustainable change in Afghanistan. So I would say let's keep that central in our work. Thank you.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, final thought is that, you asked a question about instrumentalization. I think looking at Afghanistan in the absence of active conflict as peace is missing the forest for the trees, and because the actual struggle for the women of Afghanistan is for liberation. And liberation isn't just about absence of conflict. Liberation is about the actualization of their human rights. And that's a struggle that women face everywhere in the world, and all disenfranchised people face everywhere in the world. Liberation is a different thing from an imposition of, national security agenda.
Just on what Ms. Safi has said, I echo that for sustainable change, especially in terms of women's rights and women's condition in country, there should be top-bottom, bottom-top approach. And the focus should be on both. I mean, we cannot only, there should be, of course, people-centric when the time is not ready, but meanwhile, it should not be, the top-bottom approach shouldn't be neglected, that there should be constant work on that. The only thing which I want to add is including women, I think it was said before, including women in hard political discussions and hard politics. Women shouldn't be only a discussion of the side meetings, as Ms. Safi said also. Women should be the part of the hard security discussion. They should be the part of the economic development discussion. They should be the part of the hard politics, real politics discussion. That is where I think we need at this point more. And women, if we are, if we want to have a meaningful participation of women, so that participation at all aspects should be inclusive, and women should be at the major real political discussion.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Ms. Rina Amiri for joining us earlier, and our wonderful panelists for this incredible discussion, and of course for our audience for joining us today. I want to give a special shout out and thanks to the research team that conducted this in Afghanistan, which I know is incredibly difficult. I can't emphasize enough how incredibly proud we are of Afghan civil society that has been working under very difficult situation and has figured out how to kind of adapt and work to this new environment. And I think just to echo what Rina mentioned earlier in terms of the Afghans we invest in today will reflect the Afghanistan that we see tomorrow. And I think all of us support the efforts of civil society and women's rights organizations to make sure that this isn't just a side conversation, but it's very central to what happens next in Afghanistan. Thank you, and please join me in. Thank you. Thank you.
د هشت صبح واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د هشت صبح واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ. د هشت صبح ټلګرام چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د هشت صبح ټلګرام چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ.
هشت صبح، دریچه خبر افغانستان.